I'm Emma, this is Lee, and we have the pleasure of introducing Gwen Sisior, who is the Ocean Advisor for the Permanent Mission of Palau at the United Nations. She graduated with her NREM master's degree in 2010 from UH and moved to Palau to work on several projects covering policy development in water, tourism, and the environment sector, including enhancing the Areas Network program, at local and subnational levels, as well as integrating biodiversity safeguards into various sectors. Her professional interests revolve around balancing the protection of the environment and the needs of the people, noting with understanding that many of the livelihoods of communities depend greatly on an island's biodiversity. She is also interested in small island developing states and their role in the global community, as well as their access to finance, capacity building, and technology transfer needed to implement the multilateral agreements that they are members of that lead to the overall protection and conservation of the environment. We're gonna go ahead and get started. Thank you, Gwen.
Thank you for the wonderful introduction. So let me see if I can share correctly. And please let me know, there seems to be a lag. So if in case something happens, please let me know. Sorry, so just to be sure, you're able to see my full screen?
Yes, thank you.
All right, so okay, first of all, I'm very nervous because I'm very proud to be from NREM, so I really don't want to mess up. So I apologize if I speak too fast. And my instructors at NREM have always told me that when I do presentation and I get nervous, I speak really quickly, but it's definitely something I've been trying to improve. But thank you for taking your time out to come and listen to my presentation. I know it's very different from what I've seen on the list. My presentation is really on small island, sort of giving you a small island perspective. So SIDS is small island developing states. So I did like Hawaii is an island, and we had chosen Hawaii to go to school because we felt that it was still an island. But we also, coming to Hawaii, we also realized how big Hawaii was compared to our very small island in Palau. So going back home after being in Hawaii for almost 10 years, because I went to NREM during my undergraduate, and then I went into my master's also in NREM. It was a big shock, I guess, to say when I went home, because coming in from a larger island that technically is a developed country, we had a lot of access to things that we didn't have as small islands. So going back home, I had to then readjust to being in a very small island where resources are very limited, where we had to learn to share a lot of our meager financials to be able to implement a lot of the work that we needed to do on the ground. And I started actual work on the ground, working with local communities. We had funding, but I never really did understand where that funding was coming from that helped us implement a lot of the work on the ground, such as forest management and also developing the policies that govern our environment. It wasn't until I was in this position that I realized that even as small islands, we're all members of this global community. And I had to basically learn what it means to be able to get the necessary resources to then implement it on a small island. So let me know if my slides are changing because I don't seem to see it changing.
I'm also not seeing it change.
Yeah, it's not, okay. did you see it change?
We can now see it changing.
So just a quick overview. So I want to talk about really what we did at the national level, and from there learning what that work did, but also how this work is part of a sub-regional as well as a regional level. So when I say sub-regional, it means Micronesia region. And then at the regional level within the Pacific, and then from there on to the international level. So really about how as even as small islands, the work that we do can actually help influence a lot of the work done at the international level, which then translates into programs that we can access to then implement back on the ground. So you'll see that we'll talk from the national to the regional, international, and then back down to the ground where we then implement what is needed. So hopefully the video works. So just to give you a bit of context, I wanted you to see what Palau is like. So sorry, that was a small snapshot. That video is actually longer, so but I invite you to come to Palau if you want to see the rest of the rest of the video as well as actually see what you saw. So that video sort of gave a good view of what Palau has that people would come to Palau to see, but also really it's to give you the idea of like for islands, our biodiversity are some of the best in the world. Not just Palau, but Hawaii within the Pacific, especially small islands, developing states. So this is a lot of the work that we're trying to protect. But Palau is very small. So to put it into context, Palau has about a little over 18,000 people, and that's less than the population of UH, the students at UH Manoa. So we are a very small country, and if you want to come to Palau, if you can see the route, it's 7.5 hours to Guam, and then another hour and a half to Palau. So we're a very small dot right above south of Japan, but also right above Papua New Guinea and to the east of the Philippines. So we are a small island developing state, and here at the UN we love our acronyms. So please excuse me, I'll be using the word SIDS a lot, but that's what it stands for. But we also consider ourselves as big ocean states because although our landmass is small, Palau is only 459 square kilometers. It's only about one, or actually less than 1% of our total sovereign area. So we're made up of 99% water and 1% land. But our total size or our sovereign is basically the size of Texas. Recently in 2015, Palau enacted a law. So 80% of our EEZ is actually is a protected area, is currently under protection. Most people that know Palau are usually divers because Palau is noted as one of the seven underwater wonders of the world. It's a tongue twister. So much so that we actually became inscribed in the UNESCO World Heritage Site, an entire area of rock islands, because that's how valuable those islands were. So this is a small island of only 18,000 people trying to manage a huge area, and a lot of that is marine. So it takes up a lot of work and resources that we need to be able to do all this work. So when you search Palau, you'll see a lot of these beautiful photos. So you see a lot of people that are swimming. In the top middle is the jellyfish lake. So those are non-stinging jellyfish that if you, it's not really clear, but there's actually someone in the water swimming in between all these jellyfish. We still have a very traditional, we still practice our traditions. So you'll see a lot of the dances. We still have the traditional buys that's on the bottom on the left. And when you also search Palau, you'll tend to see a lot of the photos on this large photo on the bottom. That's usually depicted in a lot of pictures for Palau and a lot of advertisements for Palau. But what most people don't know is that that set of rock islands is actually Palau's first protected area. And so this is with Islands. Most people, it's popularly known as the 70 Islands. So, but it is completely no take, no entry, and it has some of the best marine biodiversity within Palau. It's known as a breeding ground for many of Palau's reef fishes. So it was actually protected in 1956. So Palau has a tradition of bull, where in many villages, when there's too much overfishing of a particular species or an area is becoming run down because of too many people going in, the bull is set by the chief, and it basically puts a moratorium on either a species or an area. This practice was actually adopted formally, and now we use it for our protected areas network. And this is where I came in when I started my work here in Palau, and through the Ministry of Environment, where the Protected Areas Network program was housed. So just a quick overview of the Protected Areas Network. So in 2003, that's when the PAN Act was signed. And this was a result of a major bleaching event that happened in Palau in 1998. So in 2003, we note that we wanted to set up WUL, and really this act was to enable a program that would then support state governments in to protect their areas. Because in Palau, it's actually the state, or what we call local governments, that own the lands. There are no lands owned by the national government except for the land that was given to them, which their buildings are on, as well as the EEZ, or the exclusive economic zone. So those are the properties. So this program basically allowed state governments who are landowners, as well as private sector or private individuals or families that would like to put up their area for protection, to protect that area. So the PAN program was enacted in 2003. And in 2006, it was noted that for any program to be able to work, it requires funding. So a sustainable finance mechanism was identified that needed to be done. At the same time that the finance mechanism was identified, we also identified the Micronesia Challenge, was actually then proposed by Palau's president to 5 countries, as a way for us to then expand beyond Palau the idea of protected areas. It wasn't until 2008 when we had our first PAN site from one of the northern states in Babodao. And then as well as in 2000 and sorry, so in 2008, we also then um, and revise the PAN Act to then put in a sustainable finance mechanism. I don't know if any of you know, but there's a green fee that was created by this law, wherein visitors had to pay into that green fee. So then that fee would then help fund would be part of the sustainable finance mechanism. And also in recognizing the Micronesia Challenge, the Micronesia Challenge was then set up so that there would be another financing mechanism, which we'll go over in the next couple of slides. But that also had a sustainable finance mechanism that then supported all the countries that were part of the Micronesia Challenge. So we had the PAN program, we now had a finance mechanism, and at the sub-regional level at Micronesia, we also expanded this program to that. So the sub-regional Micronesia Challenge program was also a protected areas network program, but it also had a funding mechanism. So that these funding mechanism actually enabled us to do more. So they now, as of today, Palau now has there are 16 state governments in Palau, and all 16 state governments are participating in the Protected Areas Network. So this is sort of the history of the Protected Areas Network. And as you see on the picture on your left, so this is the nomination process. So we have either public or private resource owners that then allocate their land or their areas to the state governments. The state governments then sign into law that this is a protected area and then propose it to PAN. It's one of the requirements. And then the PAN office goes through a process where it's evaluated and then the approval is done by the minister. Once the approval is done, then the finance mechanism does two things. First, it provides funding for them to develop a management plan, at least a 5 to 10 year management plan for their site or sites, and then provides funding for then the implementation of that plan. So this is sort of how the protected area. So in this, we were able to then have all 16 states as well as multiple PAN sites from each states, both on terrestrial as well as marine. So this is just a quick photo of the PAN site. So you'll see in the middle, those are with the green, the two maps. So those are PAN sites on land, and then the map on the top left, those are the marine sites. And you'll notice that this is the Core Rock Island Conservation Area. This is UNESCO's World Heritage Site right here. And this is where, if you're coming for diving, this is where most of those pictures that were taken in the video were at. And then these are examples of some of the areas that we're protecting. So this is Masakalat, one of the waterfalls in Palau. So it's a water source. Of course, fish is a very important and stable food in Palau, so we need to protect that. But we also have bird sanctuaries because, you know, birds are very limited. But Palau has maybe a low number of birds, but high endemism. And this is common in a lot of the SIDS, where you have a lot of very specific birds that are only found in those countries, even though they can be found globally, but it's a specific species to Palau. So in order to able to do all of that work, funding, as I noted, was very critical. And so I wanted to talk a bit about the Protected Areas Network Fund, because the reason I wanted to focus on the fund as well is that in order to have a lot of this funding, Palau does not have the kind of funding nationally to be able to support a lot of its work. So it is dependent on support from development partners, from different entities around the world that can help us do the work that we need to do to protect our biodiversity. So one of that area in which we get a lot of support is the Protected Areas Network Fund. So as I mentioned, there is that green fee. So this is the green fee. So if you come to Palau, and I do invite you to come to Palau, and if you do, let me thank you ahead of time, because within your ticket, you will see a PPEF. It's the Pristine Paradise Environmental Fee, and that's the fee that helps supports the the PAN program. So that is the green fee. And then I talked about the sub-regional level. At the sub-regional level for the Micronesia Challenge, we have the Micronesia Challenge Endowment Fund. And this is basically the countries are putting money into a fund that raises interest, and then we can draw down the interest from that fund every year to help supplement the green fee. We can also get funding from other sources, and this is through grants. So one of the reasons why this particular fund works is because the green fee that you pay, even though it is collected by our government, the Protected Areas Network Fund is actually outside the government. It is an NGO. It is 501c3. So unfortunately, I'm really bad at finance, but I do know that it's a particular, I guess, a tax for the US. So that allows like the Nature Conservancy, which is a US based NGO, to be able then to provide direct funding to the PAN program. So this system was actually really good because the green fees are dependent on tourism. So tourism coming to Palau to be able to pay into that green fee. But when COVID happened, the green fee went to zero, which meant the only sources of funding that we can get. So we were very lucky because the endowment fund existed. So we were able to draw down that funding to be able to continue the work throughout the COVID. We were also able to get other sources such from grants from either NGOs, but also from the international sector. The green fee allocation, basically once the money is received by the Protected Areas Network Fund, we do have allocations, and this is by law that requires that at least 60% of the money has to go to the states, no matter whether it's $10, it's $10 million, at least 60% is automatically allocated to the state governments. But we also note that this program has to fund itself, so 40% are put in various areas. One of them is the emergency fund, and one of them is a reserve. And it was, again, this system was able to sustain. So the emergency fund, when something happened in PAN, this was able, that's looking at if there are storms and stuff to help recover. Those are additional funding that we can draw upon. The reserve fund was actually being set aside, and this was actually deposited into the endowment fund. So that was our regular sort of deposit from the game fee, that 5% of the total funding allocated that year, 5% would then be deposited with the endowment fund to keep it growing. The goal for Palau was $10 million on the endowment fund, and we've already exceeded that. So, and I guess in a way, we were very lucky because then that funding was able to continue our program. But in order to start the endowment fund, we needed money to put into the fund. So one of the biggest contributor for that fund, of course, was TNC and Conservation International, but they were a matching entity. So we then needed to put up funding. So for the base funding that we needed was $2 million because they were offering $1 million each. So we needed to put into fund $2 million as our co-financing. Palau, of course, again, we do not have that kind of a budget, but the Global Environment Facility, and I will talk more about this in later slides, is a funding mechanism that which funds a lot of the biological biodiversity work, the climate change work, as well as the desertification work at the international level, and Palau is a party to that, so we're able to access that fund. These three were able to start the process for us to earn money in our endowment fund. But again, this was only possible because Palau was a member of these three entities, which I will talk about at a later at the international level. So this fund enabled us to do a lot of the work for the protected areas so that we can conserve and preserve our biodiversity in Palau. But it also can be the work can be affected in Palau based on the direction of at the international level on what those priorities are. So it became important for me to understand this work not only at the national level, the sub-regional, but also at the international level. So at the sub-regional, as I said, there was the Micronesia Challenge. So in that Micronesia Challenge, we had 3 countries. So that's Palau, the Federated States of Micronesia, and Marshall Islands. We also had 2 territories, and that's Guam and Northern Mariana Islands, and 2 US territories. The goal of that was by 2020, at least 30% of our marine and 20% of our terrestrial areas were conserved. So I'm proud to say that Palau did achieve the marine as a big ocean state. We do have a large marine area, but it wasn't just our EEZ. We focused first more on our coastlines where, again, fish is very critical to us. So we needed to predict where it was growing, where the nurseries were, where and areas where they had breeding sites as well. So we focused on that. And then we also focused on terrestrial. We also had areas that were considered cultural sites. Those were also included in the pan sites and as areas of importance. So we did take that cultural aspect also in protecting areas. So in 2020, we were able to achieve the marine. Unfortunately for the terrestrial, as I say, with the very limited landmass, we were only able to achieve 12%. But that did not stop us from agreeing to a more ambitious goal. So by 2030, for the new Micronesia Challenge, we are aiming to protect or have protected areas covering 50% of our marine areas and 30% of our terrestrial. And of course, we do have a vetting process for how we accept protected areas because it's all about biodiversities and cultural. So many of the areas have to be biodiverse. There has to be a reason for why. So we're not just protecting anything and everything, but that we're focusing on high biodiverse areas and as well as cultural areas of importance that we want to preserve for the next generation, for the upcoming generations. So at the sub-regional level, we have the Micronesia Challenge, but then within the Pacific, there are 14 countries in the Pacific that are also doing a lot of their work, considered SIDS countries. So they're also doing their work at the Pacific level. So we have that regional level. And then part of it is there are also programs at the international level, such as the BioPAMA, that provides funding as well as technical support and scientific as well as knowledge needed to support a lot of the implementation on the ground. So it supports ACP countries, and this ACP is Africa, Caribbean, and the Pacific countries. And it's really focused on improving management and governance of biodiversity and natural resources. So at the sub-regional and regional level, we have these, but these for BioPAMA, it was only possible because we, as a member of the international community, we were able to negotiate to get developed countries to be able to then put funding in BioPAMA to be able to then help us at the regional level, sub-regional level, as well as on the ground. So again, even though I'm moving up these levels, we know that a lot of the work we do is informing different levels as we go, as well as the results coming back down. So at the international level, there are a lot of conventions or agreements, but I'm going to focus on the major ones that have a lot of impact on SIDS. So some of you may be familiar with some of these. So at the international level, Palau is a member of the United Nations Convention on Biological Diversity, so UNCBD. We're also a member of the United Nations Convention on Combating Desertification. And then we're also a member of, as many probably know, is the UNFCCC, which is the Framework Convention on Climate Change. Recently, as of this year, early this year, we finally concluded the negotiations on It's a very long name agreement under, but basically we call it BB&J for short. It's biodiversity beyond national jurisdictions. If you actually look at UNCBD, UNCCD, and UNFCCC, a lot of this work where countries are members of, it's really a lot within your jurisdiction, especially for CBD and UNCCD. It's really national level implementation. It's when you go to UNFCCC on climate change, where you have that regional and international focus or global. And now the new one is BB&J. So this is BB&J is really covering the high seas and high seas pockets. So I'm going to go through each convention and really kind of highlight a lot of the work that we're doing in negotiations to help then inform those negotiations and the direction for which these conventions are heading, so that we can then access the funding to be able to align it with national interest. So the newest one that I'm also working on is the Intergovernmental Negotiating Committee on developing an international legally binding instrument on plastic pollution. And this came out last year, where a lot of the countries banded together and agreed that plastic pollution has become one of the biggest global threats, and the impacts are going beyond borders, and therefore it needs to be addressed. So this is the new treaty that is now being negotiated. So I'm going to go talk a little bit more about each of this treaty and some of the things, the impacts that it has on national level implementation for SIDS. So the biggest one when it comes to the environment work, as a SIDS, the biggest access to funding and a lot of the work that you do for the environment is out of the Convention on Biological Diversity. So this particular convention has a strategy that it sets every 10 years. So the last strategy was set from 2011 to 2020, and the next strategy is now from 2021 to 2030. So in 2011 to 2020, we had the Aichi biodiversity targets. This was negotiated in the Aichi prefecture in Japan in 2010. The reason I'm speaking to, even though this particular strategy for UNCBD has expired, the reason I wanted to focus on it is because when Palau established the Protected Areas Network in 2003, then the Micronesia Challenge in 2006, and then a lot of the work for establishing so what I didn't talk about was in 2009, we became the first shark sanctuary. And then in 2010, we became a marine mammal sanctuary. So a lot of the work that the Palau has been doing, replicated across the Pacific and including other SIDS, we're basically saying that we needed to we needed to then prioritize the protection of our biodiversity. That was a negotiation that the SIDS had pushed for. So in the strategy for CBD, it basically, we had a target 11, which was then sort of a reflection of some of the things that we wanted to do, which is 17 to preserve or conserve 17% terrestrial and inland waters and 10% of coastal and marine areas. Lower than the Micronesia Challenge, but globally, that was a lot of work to be able to do that. This was still a very critical target for the SIDS. So we wanted, and based on a lot of the science that was out, it talked about that in order to protect the ocean and to sustain it, we needed at least 30%. So in the negotiation, which concluded last year in December, as you can see from the picture on the top right, it was a very long and well-fought negotiations. I really shouldn't say fight, but it was a very difficult negotiations because that target 3, where we're talking about protecting 30% of oceans, but also 30% of land by 2030 was very difficult. There are many countries that fought, but yet we were able to then use science to justify why it's necessary. That science actually says it's at least 37% of the ocean needs to be protected. And in the negotiation, a lot of the focus was, well, it should be 30%. Well, we can agree to 30% land and ocean, but the difference with what with the SIDS were fighting was that we had to say 30% of land and of ocean, because we had to ensure that they're not just going to say 30%, so it could be 10% ocean, 20% land, but that it had to be 30% of the ocean and 30% of the land. So this was one of those negotiations where SIDS were very consistent in their negotiations to get this in. So now this is in. But we also understood that there was the need for, especially for developing countries, to be able to have sustainable, to be able to use the resources. So now within the Kunming, although the IG targets really focused on just being focusing on protection, now it's protection, but also ensuring sustainable use. So I'm going to run quickly because I think I'm running out of time. So UNCCD is really about desertification, making sure, and this was really focused on soils. So what it does help us with is with spatial mapping, being able to then provide support to the to SIDS to be able to then do spatial mapping to see where they can grow, where they can grow their food that's best for agriculture, but still ensure that you're balancing out the need for protecting some of the lands as well as making having land available for then production as well. I know this is a really big one, which is climate change, but just to cover from a SIDS perspective is that mitigation there's 3 areas under UNFCCC that where it works. You have mitigation, you have adaptation, which is work that you do to be able to mitigate the impact. And then loss and damage is now one of the biggest topics in climate change, because we needed to mitigate, in other words, reduce or phase out the emissions of greenhouse. And the SIDS have always been saying it's 1.5 to stay alive, because the scenarios that have been done, anything beyond 1.5 is basically very detrimental to islands. Adaptation is that because we're not mitigating enough, we need to adapt to do things to be able to then ensure that we are mitigating the impacts of climate change. Loss and damage is now a reality. It's coming to the point where no adaptation, there are areas where adaptation is no longer viable, that it's basically going to lose out. So you can see on the left, the bottom left photo, that's basically the Prime Minister of Tuvalu speaking on what used to be a landmass that extended out and it is now underwater. So these are some of the things that we had to negotiate. And under each area, the Pacific SIDS get funding to be able to then do as much as they can, which is planting trees, renewable energies, trying to restore or at least move these croplands to other areas where they can then replant them. And that's where UNCCD can help support that, as well as some measures to be able to regrow some of the corals that were lost through growing corals, as well as growing mangroves to be able to prevent a lot of the impacts from the increase in intensity of a lot of the storms and that are occurring in the for SIDS. So the treaty on BB and high seas, which is BB and J, is really looking at the high seas pocket. And this is about managing a lot of the marine. So you have UNCBD that's doing a lot of work in the national jurisdiction, but it doesn't help if the high seas pocket, which is right next to a lot of your areas, are then exposed and allowing others to extract, because then again, this is especially true for fisheries where fish are migrating, species are migrating. So this is looking at how we can then protect some areas to put it into protected areas so that it can ensure that the fish is, using the fisheries as an example, that these can continue and that it can be done sustainably. So this particular treaty took about 19 years to negotiate, and we are very happy to finally say that it was finally, it completed its negotiations, and last week it was actually open for signatures. It required 60 signatures from 60 countries to be able to then ratify, and within 120 days. And it was 81 countries basically within 2 days of opening signed it. So now it's just a matter of within 120 days. Now this becomes a treaty, an official legally binding treaty for all the parties. And then last but not least, again, plastics is very critical. So we knew this is actually affecting also fisheries. It's been seen on fisheries. It is a big pollution for SIDS. And a lot of the pollution that come into Palau really are from outside of Palau, because we don't recognize a lot of the plastics that are floating in, and we don't have the capacity to be able to address plastics. And especially in first SIDS, it's ensuring that we address it, including in the marine environment, not just what we import into the country, but what is coming outside of the country, which is a lot of what we can't actually process in country. That impact, it's going into our shores, our tourisms are being affected, and most SIDS are reliant on tourism to be able to, have most of their economy is tourism based. So not just COVID, but then plastics are also impacting the quality of their environment, which is turning off a lot. The reason I spoke about all of these is at the international level, it sort of sets the direction for how things are being done, which then has an impact on the direction of the funding that we need to be able to then implement in country. So quickly, so Jeff, as I noted before, is one of the funding mechanisms. So you have the Convention on Biological Diversity, the UNCCD, and then the UNFCCC climate change. The decisions that are made at those three conventions affect where the priority of the funding goes, which then affects SIDS, because if the funding is for forests, but we need more actions on the marine, it becomes difficult to justify the move of that funding. So this is why as SIDS, we also have to be a big part of these international treaties, because as small islands, we don't have the resources, and this is one way for us to get resources. The climate change, of course, is a very big issue at this point. So climate change funds not only Jeff, there's the adaptation fund, and then the largest funding mechanism right now is the Green Climate Fund. And of course, there's a new funding as a result of the negotiations. If some of you may heard that in Egypt last year in December, SIDS were able to get an agreement from the countries that loss and damage fund that needs to be created. How that fund is going to work and who gets funded out of that's discussion that's ongoing, with the hope that at COP28, which is this December in Dubai, that we will able to then agree on it to operationalize that fund, which then can supplement a lot of the work that we're doing. So right now, the triple planetary crisis that a lot of people mention is climate change, biodiversity loss, and pollution. And all of these are critical because for SIDS, because their climate change impacts certain areas in SIDS, and then also aggravates the further loss of biodiversity. And the pollution is also contributing to biodiversity loss. And biodiversity is sort of seen as the answer for how we can then adapt to the impacts of climate change, as well as the livelihoods, and more importantly, the livelihoods of the people. So again, from these funding mechanisms, we were able to then develop national policies that can support state governments to allocate funding to be able to do the work that they need to do the protection, but also informs the regional level where we talk as Pacific SIDS. and then into the international level. And then, of course, because of our participation and access to those resources, we are able to then build the capacity to be able to do the research on biodiversity, collect the data that we need to be able to see how we're doing, build capacity to be able to monitor and provide protection, do a lot of the work as well as outreach for students who are basically the future of our world that we need. At the end of the day, we're going to be handing this to you and to them, and we wanted to ensure that they can be able to enjoy the same biodiversity that we used to when we were younger growing up. So that is it, and I'm sorry, I know I took too long, but thank you.
I think you missed our applause for you. It wasn't fast enough moving up here to unmute. So I'll go ahead and acknowledge any questions in the classroom, and I'll also keep an eye on the chat for any questions coming in and pass those along as they come in. So maybe we'll start with in the room. Are there any questions for Gwen? Sam.
What do you think well, first of all, thank you so much for the talk. It was really interesting. And what do you think the advantages and disadvantages of working in an international context where countries can make commitments but don't necessarily always keep those commitments is like, and how do you navigate that?
And Gwen, I just want to check, are you able to hear Sam okay? Perfect, okay.
So I think most people are probably familiar with climate change. So let me use that as an example. You always hear on the news about the negotiations and how it's moving very slowly. And I used to be like that too. I used to be really frustrated that decisions weren't being made quickly enough at the international level to be able for us to then be able to then get funding to implement it on the ground. But there are actually couple of things that happen at COP. So we have the longer term outcomes, which are the main negotiations that basically are trying to set the priorities, but at the same time, along with the COP on climate change, it's also a very big opportunity for governments to do bilateral. So bilateral is country to country or countries as a group to be able to then negotiate on things that they could do to help then implement on the ground while we wait for things to happen. So take, for example, when we're talking about, there's a lot of examples, but let's try loss and damage. So the loss and damage fund, creating a new fund is always difficult at the international level. And it's waiting for it to be created means that we're not able to do anything. But when you have these climate meetings, there's the high level meeting that usually happens at the first week. And that's where a lot of partners come together with governments that partner up not only in providing technology capacity, but also funding to pilot things or to help start up things to address issues that governments have. So we have development partners or developed countries that we partner with a lot. So they have actually stepped up saying that since we're still waiting for the negotiations for loss and damage, because it's difficult to get 196 countries to agree to how that's supposed to be, let's start by addressing some of the issues that loss and damage is. So then they provide funding. So that one is something that usually happens within a year of negotiation. So those two sort of processes happen at each of these conventions. So yes, the conventions take time, but there's also the quick results that we're able to see. So this is how we're able to then address some of the issues a lot earlier than waiting for something that's more of a long term. So loss and damage, we don't see it happening for another 4 years, but we're having development partners actually starting to provide funding for SIDS to access to implement it now.
Thank you.
Thank you, Gwen. We have 2 questions that have come in online, so I'll go ahead and take those questions while others in the room might be thinking about their questions. The first one is from Elliot Parsons, who's a faculty at UH and is actually working on climate change issues here. He says, thank you for the wonderful presentation with such a great background. I was wondering if climate change in Palau is affecting the nation's ability to manage invasive species.
So thank you for that question. And yes, so it's not just about managing the invasive species, it's also the new species that keeps coming in. So we're now, so for invasive species coming in, they adapt a lot faster than native species. So we're seeing a lot of biodiversity loss for native species, and because of that, then the invasive species are actually spreading out a lot more. And we also notice that there are certain what we call native species that now have more invasive species trait. So I apologize because I see my advisor. Hi, Dr. Chan. Hi, Dr. Idol. um, that our native species has been recognized in Palau, has been used in our medicine, so it is in our history that it has been there for a long time, are now overgrowing a lot of our other native species. So it's called gabias. It's similar to myelin weed, I think, but we've been using this for a long time, and it's because now with the heat, it grows a lot better because in a dense jungle, it's colder for some reason, it doesn't grow out. But now with the heat, we see it actually growing out of the jungle very quickly. So these are things that we're noticing is happening in the country, but it's kind of hard because technically they're native species. So we don't want to get rid of them, but because of their invasiveness, it's just kind of difficult to say, like to get funding to address an invasive species that's not an invasive species. I hope that made sense.
That's a really interesting challenge. So, and I'll give Dr. Chan and Dr. Idol a moment to ask you questions in just a moment. We have one more question that came in online from Michelle. Mahalo for your talk, Gwen. I'm curious if you've seen instances of limited climate data impacting Palau's access to certain funding mechanisms.
So that is a very big issue now, not just for Palau, but for SIDS. Funding is, of course, getting scarce with all the impacts. It's not just for developing countries, but developed countries also face impacts as well. So and even more so with the impacts of COVID that they had to deal with. So funding is becoming scarce, and therefore it's really hard to be able to address a lot of the needs. And so one of the things that they do is then require that you have to have a lot of data to sort of inform why this is an issue. And one of the things we don't have a lot of is, again, we need funding to be able to then address the issue, to get the data to see where we are so that we can address the issue. But in order to apply for the funding, you need the data to prove that but we need funding to get it becomes a sort of a chicken and the egg kind of issue. And then data is very limited. It's one of the biggest issues. And even in the UN for SDGs, trying to really get a clear picture of where the globe is, it's hard because most developing countries, I would probably say a lot of them, majority of them, do not have the necessary data to be able to report against the SDGs. And that was well noted during the SDG summit in June. That data, it's data. We need data, not just in environment, but in climate change, plastics, in poverty, pretty much every sector.
Huge need for people to do if they're interested maybe in moving on for a PhD after their master's. So we are at 4:24 here, so we're past the closing time. However, I just wanted to give a brief moment in closing for Dr. Chan or Dr. Idol to ask any questions or make any comments if they wish to, since they were a part of supporting you through your master's program 13 years ago.
Well, let me say something. Gwen, I'm so happy to see you. You're one of my first or second student, and I'm really pleased to see how well you're doing right now. just wondering if some of those courses like actually help. I think you took some international development or some trade classes. Was that helpful in your current position on strategizing how to get funding, how to collaborate and partner with other countries to make it stronger in applying for grants, and what are your success rates, basically?
Thank you, Dr. Chan. It's so lovely to see you.
Yeah.
But I also owe a lot for to you for actually getting me into the project development, because negotiations isn't really something that's taught. You really have to experience it to learn it. But what NREM did give me was a good understanding of the environment and how it works. That was very critical, because if you come to the international negotiations, you realize that a lot of the negotiators are either lawyers or from foreign affairs who've never really touched the work on the ground. So I'm one of those unique negotiators where I understand not just projects, but also funding and how that implements on the ground. And that's the background I came with, not only understanding the environment, but then experiencing project management that you gave me the opportunity to do so with the Albanian project, and learning through that. So then I got hired as a project manager to do a lot of the implementation on the ground. So I was able to actually implement policies in Palau, not only in water, but in tourism, really looking at from an environmental lens, and then coming into the international level and realizing that these negotiators really do not have that background. So they tend to like think big, but it's not practical. So to me, NREM gave me that foundation I needed to be able to actually do my work well. So I am also the PSIDS negotiator. So I actually also coordinate a lot of the negotiation for the 14 islands. And being from Hawaii, the fact that I learned in Hawaii, I was able to also learn from the others. So it's a really big thanks to NREM, actually.
Thank you. We're very proud of you.
Wonderful. And Dr. Idle, closing question and or comment?
Sure, thanks. I echo Dr. Chan's sense of pride. It's great to see you, kind of progressing and really representing Palau well. So kind of let's put that in reverse. What is one thing from your work there in Palau that perhaps could help us here as we work on, conservation, climate change, marine environments here? And I will mention, you said you guys have a green fee. We have debated the green fee here in Hawaii at the state level. So that or anything else, maybe some advice you can help us with as we work on these issues.
No, so I guess the one thing that we always need help with is, again, as mentioned, it's really data. So data on, and it's really capacity building on collecting and understanding that data as well. So data analysis as well. So I was really fortunate to also work with, so because of NREM and the instructors like Dr. Chan, Dr. Idle, Dr. Mura, working with them actually allowed me, because in a small island setting, you sort of need to know a lot of things. But at the same time, one of the things that I really didn't do that well is data, and that's now really critical. So we, even being there and knowing that you're doing a lot of the methodology, developing the methodologies for how, looking at it also from a small island perspective, we don't have a lot of resources. How do you make it so it's in the technology transfer basically to small islands that barely has a lot of understanding and capacity to be able to do this, to do a lot of the work for data. So that's one thing. And then for the green fee, Palau should, well, I will always say this, Palau does not take credit. We are not the inventors of green fee. It was actually Cook Islands. We learned from Cook Islands, but we also learned from their error. So the green fee, I talked about how the PAN fund was actually outside the government. That was a lesson learned from Cook Islands, because it stayed in the environment and stayed in the government, and therefore they were able to either appropriate it somewhere else, or everybody had a chance to apply. So you really didn't see a lot of that trickle down effect into the environment, of which the purpose of that fund was supposed to be. So a lesson learned is we took out that fund to then outside the government, so and ensure that the law, whatever money goes in, is the same amount of money that goes out to the NGO that manages that fund. And because having that 501c3 tax status allowed us to be able to then grow that fund. And that's another thing, because the government can't invest, but outside the government, it can invest, so it continues to grow. And then one of the things, the main things that we learned out of COVID is the diversity of the funding mechanism. So not just the green fee, but that endowment fund again was really critical in when something happened. And when COVID happened, we were still able to, at bare minimum, but still we were able to continue the work, that people weren't laid off, that it actually was able to then continue, so that when we reopened, the green fee is now, and now we're able to do more, but the work didn't stop. That's the only thing I would say.
Thanks, great lessons, appreciate it.
Gwen, I just want to express deep appreciation for both the work you're doing as well as your willingness to share with us today. Dr. Mira is actually in the room today. Sorry, it's not panning across the rest of the audience other than occasionally the back of Wade's head. But Dr. Mira is here, so he did hear your kind comment earlier. Suzanne Case, who's on today, also shared very interesting. You have a strong command of complex international conservation issues and a practical and articulate interpretation for us. So I just wanted to share that comment with you because I think all of us are feeling that way. So thank you so much for being with us, sharing today, and we look forward to crossing paths next time you're in the islands.
Thank you. But again, my biggest thanks to NREM. So all of you guys are really lucky to be able to go to NREM, because I miss my college. Oh, Mira-san. Oh my goodness. This is such a happy.
All right, thank you so much. We'll let you go. We know it's very late at night on the East Coast, but thank you so much for being with us tonight.
Thank you. Bye.